Before the jury enters each morning, the courtroom exists in a suspended state, quiet but charged, where lawyers, reporters, and observers silently assess one another. In this narrow window, no testimony is given, no rulings are made, yet tensions surface through posture, expressions, and subtle movements that hint at the day ahead. Defense attorneys arrive first, followed closely by prosecutors, each group studied carefully by the press for signs of confidence, strain, or strategic concern. On this particular morning, an unusual incident briefly disrupts the gravity of the setting, drawing attention before proceedings officially begin. A senior defense attorney enters holding a banana in a manner that momentarily confuses onlookers, treating the harmless object with exaggerated seriousness. Court security monitors the interaction closely, reinforcing the invisible boundary separating the gallery from the legal arena beyond the wooden gate. The moment passes without incident, offering fleeting levity before attention shifts back to the central matter awaiting the jury. As order is restored, anticipation builds for the continuation of testimony from a key witness referred to publicly as Jane Doe. Jane Doe's testimony has already introduced allegations involving violence, coercion, and control within an intimate relationship with the defendant. Her account forms a critical component of the prosecution's effort to establish a broader pattern of abuse and exploitation. The defense prepares to challenge her credibility, intent on reframing events described during direct examination. When court resumes, attention centers on the transition from narrative testimony to cross-examination, where strategy often outweighs emotion. The presiding judge reminds the courtroom of procedural boundaries, signaling that advocacy must remain within legal and ethical limits. As jurors take their seats, the atmosphere tightens, and all informal observations give way to the formal mechanics of trial. What follows is not merely a recounting of events, but a contest over interpretation, responsibility, and the meaning of consent. The defense begins by revisiting a prior altercation, asserting that Jane Doe initiated physical contact during a heated argument. This assertion becomes the foundation of a broader narrative suggesting shared culpability rather than unilateral violence. Prosecutors remain attentive, anticipating how this line of questioning may attempt to shift blame onto the alleged victim. As questions progress, the courtroom listens for distinctions between factual clarification and implied judgment. The tension escalates as legal arguments approach a sensitive threshold involving accountability and victim responsibility. Par deux, sept. The defense frames its questions carefully, suggesting that prior knowledge of the defendant's behavior should influence how the jury interprets the confrontation described. This approach implies that awareness of risk alters responsibility, subtly reframing violence as a foreseeable outcome rather than a prosecutable act. Jane Doe responds cautiously, maintaining that fear and familiarity do not equate to consent or acceptance of harm. Her testimony emphasizes patterns of control and escalation, not isolated moments detached from their broader context. As the exchange unfolds, murmurs ripple through the gallery, signaling discomfort with the direction of the questioning. The judge interrupts, instructing counsel to clarify the legal relevance of attributing initiation to the alleged victim. Defense attorneys argue that sequence matters, asserting that the first physical act shapes subsequent interpretation. The judge responds firmly, stating that initiation alone cannot justify or excuse later violence under the law. This intervention marks a critical turning point, redirecting the trajectory of cross-examination. The courtroom absorbs the significance of the ruling, recognizing its implications for how abuse cases are argued. Prosecutors seize the moment to reinforce distinctions between reaction, self-protection, and culpability. The judge reiterates that legal standards do not permit transforming victim responses into grounds for blame. This clarification establishes boundaries, limiting how far defense narratives may extend without crossing into impermissible territory. Observers note the careful balance between allowing robust defense and preventing prejudicial framing. Jane Doe continues answering questions, now under clearer judicial guidance regarding relevance and scope. Her demeanor remains composed, though the emotional weight of revisiting traumatic events is evident. The jury listens intently, tasked with separating legal instruction from persuasive rhetoric. Each answer contributes incrementally to a larger picture of power dynamics within the relationship. The courtroom atmosphere shifts from confrontation towards structured examination. What began as an attempt to redirect blame now highlights the limits of such strategies within judicial oversight. With the court's boundaries established, the defense pivots, focusing on inconsistencies they claim exist between Jane Doe's current testimony and earlier statements. These questions are delivered methodically, aiming to introduce doubt without revisiting prohibited assumptions about responsibility. Jane Doe acknowledges minor discrepancies while emphasizing that trauma can affect memory without altering the underlying truth of events. Prosecutors object selectively, arguing that certain comparisons mischaracterize prior records or remove context essential to understanding her responses. The judge sustains some objections and overrules others, carefully managing the rhythm of questioning. This measured intervention underscores the court's role in filtering advocacy through procedural fairness. As testimony continues, the jury observes not only what is said, but how each side frames credibility and motive. Legal analysts later note that such moments often shape juror perception more than dramatic revelations. The defense introduces references to messages and communications, suggesting mutual conflict rather than unilateral aggression. Jane Doe explains these exchanges as attempts to de-escalate situations marked by unpredictability and fear. Her explanations align with earlier descriptions of controlling behavior and emotional pressure. Prosecutors reinforce this interpretation during brief redirect, highlighting consistency across multiple accounts. The judge reminds jurors that credibility assessments must consider context, not isolated excerpts. This instruction reframes the evidence within broader relational dynamics. As the session progresses, fatigue becomes visible among participants, reflecting the intensity of sustained examination. Court officials call a brief recess, allowing jurors and counsel to regroup. During the pause, observers discuss the judge's earlier intervention as a defining moment of the day. Commentators suggest it may influence how future witnesses are questioned. When proceedings resume, attention returns to the legal standards guiding evaluation of testimony. The case advances incrementally, shaped as much by rulings as by words spoken on the stand. After the recess, the prosecution resumes with a focused redirect, aiming to clarify points that may have been obscured during cross-examination. Prosecutors revisit key moments in the timeline, emphasizing escalation patterns rather than isolated incidents. Jane Doe describes how arguments often followed a predictable cycle, beginning with verbal pressure and ending in physical intimidation. Her testimony highlights how perceived calm periods created false impressions of stability between episodes of conflict. The defense objects to characterization language, prompting the judge to instruct the witness to stick to observed actions. Jane Doe complies, recounting specific behaviors without attributing intent or motive. This adjustment reinforces the evidentiary distinction between description and interpretation. Jurors appear attentive, taking notes as factual details replace broader narrative framing. Prosecutors introduce corroborating materials intended to situate testimony within documented interactions. The defense challenges relevance, arguing that selected materials lack direct connection to alleged physical acts. The judge permits limited admission, explaining that context may assist jurors in evaluating credibility. This ruling further delineates permissible scope without endorsing either side's interpretation. Jane Doe remains on the stand as questioning narrows to specific dates and locations. Precision becomes central, as minor inconsistencies are weighed against overall coherence. The court reiterates that perfection of memory is not the standard for truthful testimony. This reminder seeks to prevent undue emphasis on minor discrepancies. As the session nears its end, both sides appear mindful of the cumulative effect of the day's exchanges. Observers note a shift away from spectacle toward procedural clarity. The judge signals that the witness will be excused shortly, pending final questions. The courtroom settles into a measured calm as testimony approaches a temporary conclusion. As questioning concludes, the judge addresses the jury directly, reiterating the legal framework governing how testimony should be evaluated. Jurors are reminded that emotional reactions must be set aside in favor of careful consideration of evidence and instruction. The defense requests clarification on earlier rulings, seeking to preserve objections for the record. The judge responds succinctly, confirming that arguments implying victim responsibility remain outside acceptable bounds. This exchange reinforces the court's stance on preventing prejudicial narratives from influencing deliberation. Jane Doe is formally excused, stepping down from the stand without visible reaction. The courtroom acknowledges the moment quietly, aware of the weight carried by her testimony. Prosecutors indicate readiness to proceed with additional witnesses, signaling that the case extends beyond a single account. The defense signals intent to continue contesting credibility through alternative evidence. Court administrators outline scheduling adjustments as proceedings move forward. Media representatives begin drafting summaries, focusing heavily on the judge's intervention earlier in the day. Legal commentators identify that moment as a likely reference point in later analysis. Outside the courtroom, public discussion intensifies, often simplifying nuanced rulings into headlines. Analysts caution that such simplification risks misrepresenting procedural decisions. The judge adjourns the session, reminding all parties of confidentiality obligations. As participants exit, the courtroom empties gradually, leaving behind an atmosphere of unresolved tension. The day's proceedings underscore how judicial guidance shapes the boundaries of courtroom argument. Observers reflect on the balance between advocacy and fairness demonstrated during testimony. The case advances with critical legal principles reaffirmed, rather than dramatic revelations. What follows will depend on how subsequent evidence aligns with the standards emphasized today. In the days following Jane Doe's testimony, legal analysts revisit the judge's rulings to assess their potential impact on the remainder of the trial. Attention centers on how limits placed on defense arguments may shape questioning of future witnesses. Prosecutors adjust their strategy, preparing to introduce testimony that reinforces patterns already outlined. The defense evaluates alternative approaches, shifting emphasis toward procedural challenges and evidentiary standards. Court filings submitted after the session reflect careful language, avoiding themes previously rejected by the judge. This recalibration illustrates how real-time rulings influence trial direction beyond the courtroom. Jurors are instructed to disregard media coverage, though awareness of public discourse remains unavoidable. Experts note that high-profile cases often test the effectiveness of such instructions. The court schedules hearings to address admissibility of additional materials before they reach the jury. These hearings occur outside the jury's presence, underscoring the separation between legal debate and factual evaluation. Observers recognize that momentum in the case now depends on cumulative evidence rather than singular testimony. The judge emphasizes consistency, reminding counsel that all arguments must align with established legal principles. As preparations continue, both sides acknowledge that credibility assessments will ultimately rest with the jury. The trial progresses methodically, shaped by precedent as much as by contested narratives. Each procedural step reinforces the framework within which personal accounts are judged. Analysts suggest that the judge's earlier intervention may influence jury expectations regarding acceptable argumentation. The courtroom atmosphere remains restrained, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations. With foundational testimony complete, attention turns toward corroboration and contradiction. The case advances toward its next phase without dramatic shifts in posture. Outcomes remain uncertain, dependent on evidence yet to be presented. As the trial approaches its later stages, both sides prepare to integrate testimony, exhibits, and judicial rulings into cohesive closing narratives. Prosecutors focus on demonstrating continuity between witness accounts, emphasizing consistency with legal standards outlined throughout proceedings. The defense concentrates on procedural safeguards, reminding jurors of the burden of proof and the necessity of certainty. The judge reiterates instructions designed to anchor deliberations within evidence presented in court, not external commentary. Legal observers note that such instructions often carry increased weight after high-profile courtroom exchanges. The case continues to draw attention as an example of how abuse allegations are litigated under judicial oversight. Analysts highlight the importance of rulings that define acceptable advocacy without constraining legitimate defense rights. Public discussion persists, frequently centering on simplified interpretations of complex procedural moments. The court remains focused on ensuring that deliberations proceed free from prejudice or improper influence. As evidence presentation nears completion, jurors are reminded of their responsibility to assess facts impartially. The judge signals that closing arguments will follow once remaining evidentiary matters are resolved. Participants acknowledge that the trial's outcome will hinge on cumulative evaluation rather than any single exchange. The proceedings underscore the role of judicial guidance in shaping how sensitive testimony is framed and received. Regardless of verdict, the trial contributes to broader legal discourse on victim blaming and courtroom boundaries. Observers recognize that such cases often influence future advocacy strategies and judicial expectations. The courtroom remains a space governed by law, procedure, and restraint amid public scrutiny. As this phase concludes, attention shifts from testimony toward deliberation. The narrative transitions from examination to judgment, guided by established legal principles. The case advances toward resolution without abandoning procedural rigor. Final determinations await the jury's careful consideration of all evidence presented.